There is a specific brand of betrayal that almost never gets noticed the moment it starts. It doesn't pop up as an action, but as an explanation. Before any external move, before any visible breach of commitment, something far more decisive happens: rationalization. Machiavelli would immediately grasp that the most dangerous kind of betrayal isn't the one happening in the shadows, but the one that's been internally justified as legitimate. Women who rationalize cheating rarely see themselves as the bad guys. That's the first illusion. They see themselves as wronged, neglected, misunderstood, or stuck in circumstances that forced their hand. The act isn't interpreted as a choice, but as an inevitable consequence. And where there's an inevitable consequence, guilt is off the table, at least consciously. Machiavelli knew humans have an uncanny knack for rewriting their own narratives to preserve their self-image. Few people can act against their values without first redefining what those values mean. Rationalization does exactly that. It doesn't eliminate the moral contradiction. It slowly dissolves it, replacing it with a logic that seems, on the surface, completely coherent. The process starts subtle. Little thoughts creep in and fly under the radar. Nobody's perfect. Everyone messes up. Relationships are messy. There's no absolute right or wrong. These ideas sound mature, even philosophical. But in practice, they act like open doors. Each one weakens an internal boundary. Each one turns a core value into something up for negotiation. Machiavelli would observe that when boundaries become too flexible, they stop protecting the person who set them. The woman who starts rationalizing infidelity isn't necessarily looking for a quick thrill. She's looking for internal coherence. She wants to keep seeing herself as good, fair, and sensible, even as she inches toward behavior she would have previously condemned. Rationalization isn't an excuse made after the fact. It's the prep work done before. Another crucial point is shifting the blame. The internal narrative starts moving the decision-making center to the outside. The partner, the context, the past, the grind, the lack of attention. If things were different, I wouldn't be doing this. That phrase, even when silent, is powerful. It transforms an active choice into a passive reaction, and reactions don't require moral responsibility. Machiavelli would see this as a classic mechanism of psychological self-preservation. The individual protects their identity by offloading the weight of the decision. Betrayal stops being "I cheated" and becomes "this happened to me." That semantic shift isn't innocent. It allows the person to move forward without feeling like they're becoming someone they despise. Modern American culture doubles down on this pattern. Narratives that exalt unrestricted authenticity, the right to immediate happiness, and constant emotional validation create the perfect petri dish for rationalization. Any discomfort gets interpreted as a sign of oppression. Any limit looks like repression. In this scenario, cheating gets rebranded as liberation, not as a breach, but as an expression of the true self. Machiavelli would warn that this logic is extremely convenient and extremely dangerous. When an individual starts justifying their impulses with sophisticated moral speeches, they lose the ability to self-evaluate honestly. The mind becomes its own defense attorney, not a judge. And a mind that only defends itself never learns. It just repeats. There's a detail that rarely gets discussed. Rationalization doesn't happen all at once. It's built in layers. First, you normalize the thought. Then, you normalize the emotion. Finally, you normalize the behavior. When the act actually happens, it already feels consistent with the internal narrative. At that point, the betrayal doesn't generate shock. It generates relief. Because it resolves the tension created by prolonged dissonance. Machiavelli would understand that this relief is a trap. It doesn't indicate a real resolution, just a temporary suspension of internal conflict. Rationalization doesn't eliminate the psychological cost. It just kicks the can down the road. But in that initial moment, it offers something irresistible. The sensation of being right even when you're wrong, or at least of being justified. The most dangerous part of this process is that it's rarely perceived by anyone looking in from the outside. The woman remains functional, coherent, maybe even the head of the PTA or a star employee. It's precisely this normalcy that's so confusing. Rationalization doesn't create immediate chaos. It creates just enough internal order for the behavior to advance without resistance. Machiavelli would summarize this stage clearly. When someone needs to explain too much why they're right, they've usually already crossed a line they don't want to admit to. Rationalizing betrayal isn't a sign of freedom. It's a sign that the mind has started trading principles for psychological comfort. And when principles become negotiable, behavior becomes just a question of opportunity. For Machiavelli, no rationalization appears out of thin air. It always serves a strategic function, reducing internal friction while an unpopular decision matures. In the case of women who rationalize cheating, the central mechanism isn't desire, but moral licensing. The mind creates gradual permission so that behavior that was once unacceptable starts looking reasonable, then understandable, and finally, inevitable. The first move is almost imperceptible. A silent revision of her own history. The relationship gets reinterpreted through a selective lens. Positive moments lose weight. Conflicts get the spotlight. The past is re-edited to support the emotional present. I tried. I put in the work. I gave him chances. These phrases aren't objective evaluations. They are narrative tools. They build the foundation upon which the betrayal can rest without shaking her self-image. Machiavelli would recognize a classic pattern here. When someone wants to act against an agreement, they first frame the agreement as flawed. The alliance stops being viewed as a pact and starts being viewed as a prison. And in internal logic, every prison justifies an escape. This inversion is crucial. Betrayal stops being a rupture and becomes psychological liberation. Another central element is strategic comparison. The woman starts observing other relationships, other possibilities, other versions of herself. Not necessarily to act immediately, but to weigh alternatives. I could be happier. I could be different. These comparisons feed the idea that staying put is a missed opportunity. Machiavelli knew that nothing weakens a commitment more than the perception of advantageous, unexplored alternatives. Rationalization also leans heavily on contemporary therapy speak. Terms like boundaries and emotional needs and authenticity, what an undeservingness, are used not as tools for self-awareness, but as moral shields. The cheating gets framed as a response to a structural failure of the other person. My needs weren't met. This phrase, repeated internally, shifts responsibility and transforms desire into a right. Machiavelli would observe that this logic creates a specific danger, confusing explanation with absolution. Understanding why you want something doesn't equate to legitimizing the action, but the mind, interested in reducing guilt, blurs these lines. Understanding turns into authorization, and from that point on, the decision is already half made, even if the body hasn't acted yet. There is also the role of silence. Many women who rationalize cheating avoid direct confrontations before the act, not because they don't know what they want, but because a confrontation would require owning the intention. As long as the decision remains internal, it seems less real, less definitive. Silence protects ambiguity, and ambiguity is fertile ground for rationalization. Machiavelli knew that undeclared decisions are easier to sustain psychologically. They allow for a gradual advance without explicit commitment, innocent conversations, selective confiding, small boundary breaches that can still be explained away as nothing. Each step is too small to seem grave, but together, they form a path of no return. Another essential aspect is the preservation of social image. Rationalization doesn't just serve one's own conscience, but possible future narratives. The woman constructs, even unconsciously, a story that can be told if she gets questioned. A story where she appears as someone who suffered, tried, resisted, and only then had no choice. Machiavelli would see this as strategic preparation of the social terrain. This process creates a deceptive sense of control. The woman believes she's handling the situation in a mature and conscious way, when in reality she's just postponing the confrontation with her own responsibility. Rationalization gives the impression of lucidity, but it frequently covers up fear. Fear of owning the desire, fear of breaking up, fear of losing approval. In the end, Machiavelli would be blunt. When the mind works overtime to justify an action, it's because that action threatens the identity the person wants to preserve. The rationalization of betrayal isn't a sign of moral clarity, but of unresolved conflict. And unresolved conflicts don't disappear with sophisticated explanations. They just transform into patterns, repeated, refined, and increasingly harder to break. When rationalization consolidates, it stops being just a mental mechanism and starts reorganizing the woman's internal functioning. The mind, now committed to the narrative it built, begins to align emotions, body, and behavior to sustain the decision that hasn't been officially made, but has already been internally accepted. Machiavelli would understand this stage as the moment when betrayal stops being a hypothesis and becomes a probable destiny. From a psychological standpoint, a gradual reduction of dissonance occurs. The initial tension between old values and current desires decreases, not because the conflict was resolved, but because one side was silenced. The mind learns to ignore red flags. Guilt doesn't disappear, it gets rebranded. It starts being seen as fear, social conditioning, or residue of outdated morality. This reinterpretation doesn't eliminate the emotional cost, it just shifts it. The body enters this process as an involuntary ally. The anticipation of external validation generates real physiological responses: excitement, relief, a feeling of lightness. In contrast to the heavy emotional weight associated with the original relationship, these sensations feel like proof that the decision is correct. The body confirms the mental narrative. Machiavelli would observe that human beings easily confuse relief with truth. Whatever reduces momentary pain starts to look right, even when it creates structural problems in the long run. There is also a noticeable shift in daily behavior. The woman becomes more guarded, more selective with the info she shares, more careful with texts and schedules, not out of conscious malice, but out of an internal need to keep two narratives running in parallel. This duplicity requires constant energy. The nervous system stays on high alert, even if it's disguised by moments of euphoria. Psychology recognizes this pattern as compartmentalization. The mind creates separate boxes to avoid a direct collision between actions and values. In one box, she continues being the partner, the mom, the professional, the ethical person. In the other, she lives out the narrative that justifies the betrayal. As long as these compartments don't crash into each other, functioning seems stable. But this stability is artificial. Machiavelli knew that artificial systems require constant maintenance. Any glitch, any unexpected confrontation, threatens to expose the incoherence. That's why women who rationalize cheating often avoid deep conversations, direct questions, or situations that require a clear stance. Clarity is dangerous for someone running on justifications. Ambiguity, on the other hand, offers shelter. Another important effect is the shift in perception of the partner. He stops being seen as a complete individual and gets reduced to a function: that which is missing, that which wasn't enough, that which failed. This reduction isn't fair, but it's functional for the internal narrative. The more the other person is simplified, the easier it becomes to justify one's own choice. Machiavelli would understand this as strategic dehumanization, a common step before any rupture. Over time, rationalization also alters how the woman sees herself. She starts identifying as someone who knows what she wants, who doesn't get tied down by convention, who acts with emotional maturity. This self-image reinforces the behavior because it creates coherence between who she believes she is and what she is about to do. Questioning the betrayal at this point would be questioning her newly constructed identity. The problem is that this identity rests on shaky ground. It depends on the continuity of external validation and the maintenance of the internal narrative. Any threat to these elements, rejection, discovery, frustration, reactivates the original conflict with amplified force. The body feels this as a sudden drop. Anxiety, delayed guilt, a feeling of emptiness. The rationalization, which seemed like the solution, reveals itself as merely a postponement. Machiavelli would say this is the price of decisions made without internal sovereignty. When the mind dedicates itself more to justifying than to governing, it loses authority over itself. The woman starts being driven by circumstances she helped create, but no longer fully controls. Behavior, then, stops being a strategic choice and becomes a reaction to a script that has taken on a life of its own. At this stage, betrayal is no longer just an imminent act. It has become the expression of a misaligned psychological system, where the need to preserve self-image overrode the capacity to act with clarity. And Machiavelli would be ruthless in concluding, no rationalization, no matter how sophisticated, substitutes the power of a decision made with full awareness of its costs. When this pattern drags on, what starts as rationalization transforms into structure. The woman is no longer just justifying an isolated act. She is reorganizing her entire way of dealing with conflict, boundaries, and responsibility. Machiavelli would watch this point closely, because this is where betrayal stops being an episode and becomes a method. And methods, once internalized, tend to repeat themselves. The first visible effect is the normalization of duplicity. The mind gets used to sustaining two versions of reality without feeling immediate shock. On one side, the social image, coherent, responsible, sensitive. On the other, the internal life guided by self-granted permissions. This split doesn't seem problematic at first because it works. But anything that works at the cost of hiding charges high interest over time, the body feels this duplicity as constant tension. Even when there are moments of pleasure or relief, they are intercut with internal vigilance. The nervous system remains active, looking out for risks of exposure, conflict, or narrative collapse. The woman might even convince herself she's at peace with her choices, but the body tells a different story. Difficulty relaxing fully, a sensation of always calculating, emotional burnout with no apparent cause. Machiavelli knew that no one governs well when they have to hide too much. The effort to maintain external coherence while living, internal incoherence consumes strategic energy. That energy stops being used for real growth and gets spent on maintaining appearances. Over time, a diffuse feeling of hollowness sets in. The betrayal, which promised vitality, starts producing the opposite. There is also a profound impact on the capacity to establish future bonds. Rationalization teaches the mind that boundaries are negotiable when they cause discomfort. This weakens trust not just from others, but the woman's trust in herself. If everything can be explained away, everything can be repeated, the internal promise loses value. And where promises lose value, stability becomes fragile. Another little recognized effect is displacing guilt to the exterior. Even after the affair, the rationalized narrative tends to stick. If something goes wrong, it's the betrayed partner's fault, the context, the lack of understanding from others. This pattern prevents real learning. The woman doesn't see herself as the full author of her own choices, but as a character reacting to circumstances. Machiavelli would consider this a loss of sovereignty. As time passes, this logic generates resentment, not just toward the other person, but toward life itself. The feeling of having done what was needed doesn't eliminate the perception that something was broken internally. The mind tries to compensate with new justifications, new stimuli, new narratives. But every added layer pushes the possibility of internal coherence further away. From a psychological perspective, this creates a cycle that's hard to break. Rationalization protects in the short term, but weakens in the long term. The individual becomes dependent on external validation to prop up their own identity. When that validation fails, the void appears with a vengeance. And a void isn't resolved with explanations. It demands reconstruction. Machiavelli would warn that decisions made to avoid immediate discomfort tend to produce structural discomfort. Rationalized betrayal avoids a conflict now, but creates several later, internal, relational, existential. The cost isn't paid all at once, but in constant installments distributed over the years. And continuous installments corrode more than one-time shocks. The central point here isn't moral condemnation, it's strategic lucidity. The woman who turns rationalization into a habit loses the ability to act with clarity when it really matters. Everything becomes explainable, but nothing becomes solid. Life starts being managed by narratives, not by conscious decisions. And Machiavelli knew that those who live by narratives end up prisoners of them. At this stage, the cheating is no longer the main problem. It is merely the most visible symptom of a fragile internal government. The real problem is the gradual abdication of full responsibility over one's own choices. And no explanation, no matter how refined, replaces the strength of a mind that owns its actions without needing to hide behind justifications. There is a moment when rationalization stops protecting and starts collecting. Machiavelli would end this analysis not with an accusation, but with a repositioning. Because for him, the true danger isn't making a mistake, but building an internal logic that prevents correction. Women who rationalize betrayal aren't condemned for it. They are vulnerable as long as they don't retake the reins of their own mind. The first strategic step is recognizing that all prolonged rationalization is a sign of unresolved conflict. When the mind needs to explain too much, it's because it has lost simplicity. Decisions that are truly owned don't require elaborate defenses. They stand on clarity. Machiavelli would say that a strong mind doesn't seek constant absolution. It accepts the weight of choices and moves forward with coherence. Reassuming this internal government requires abandoning the role of victim of circumstance, not in the sense of denying real difficulties, but stopping the use of them as a moral license. As long as the woman believes she had no choice, she remains trapped in the same pattern. Freedom begins when one acknowledges, "I chose." This admission doesn't weaken, it strengthens, because it hands back control. There is also the need to rebuild internal boundaries. Boundaries don't exist to restrict, but to preserve psychic energy. A mind without clear limits lives in constant negotiation with itself, wasting resources on unnecessary internal conflicts. Machiavelli valued well-defined borders. He knew that whoever doesn't establish internal limits ends up being governed by impulses or convenient narratives. Another essential point is reviewing one's own identity. Many women who rationalize betrayal start defining themselves by speeches. "I'm intense, I'm real, I don't follow the herd." These identities work while they justify behaviors, but they collapse when they demand responsibility. Reconstruction starts when identity stops being an argument and becomes a posture. From a psychological point of view, this brings real relief. The mind no longer needs to sustain two versions of reality. The body comes out of that state of continuous vigilance. The energy previously spent on concealment and justification returns as clarity and stability. Machiavelli would understand this as internal efficiency. Less waste, more direction. It is also important to understand that the way out isn't to moralize the past, but to organize the future. Prolonged guilt weakens just as much as excessive rationalization. Both keep the individual trapped in what has already happened. The strategy lies in using the experience as data, not as a sentence. The mistake becomes information. Information guides more solid choices. Machiavelli would advise a simple, yet radical change. Substitute justifications for conscious decisions. This might mean confronting uncomfortable truths, ending relationships clearly, redefining values, or accepting losses without needing to spin them into heroic narratives. Dignity isn't about looking right, but about acting with coherence. When a woman abandons the need to explain herself all the time, something changes deeply. She stops being reactive and becomes deliberate. Behavior stops answering to momentary impulses and starts reflecting a personal strategy. This transition doesn't happen without discomfort, but the discomfort is now productive, not corrosive. Machiavelli would summarize this closing directly. Whoever governs their own mind doesn't need to justify their acts, only assume their consequences. The rationalization of betrayal weakens because it tries to protect the image. Internal sovereignty strengthens because it protects integrity. And integrity, unlike explanations, sustains choices over time. In the end, the question isn't about cheating or not cheating. It's about who is in command when temptation arises. As long as the mind hunts for excuses, command has been lost. When the mind accepts full responsibility, command returns. And for Machiavelli, there is no greater power than that.